Hi, friends. Welcome to another episode of Soaring Through Chaos. And the reason we do this is to share. We are in the midst of quite an experience, the pandemic. And every day there's things that are unexpected that are happening. Some of us are worried about health, some of us are worried about loss of life, of our friends and family. Some of us are worried about jobs and sustainability, financial or otherwise just surviving. But amid all this, we know that because we are in this region of discomfort, because we are going through one of the more uncomfortable parts of our life, there's a hope, there's a possibility of growing. There's a possibility that we can accept it, we can even grieve it and grow through this. And a few years ago, I had the experience of growing by actually going and meeting with people such as Tommy Lee Woon at the Stanford Center for Compassion. The Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education brought together many people from different walks of life, and we learned from each other for about 1 year. We stayed in touch. So, Tommy, it was such a joy to have known you as one of the people that I learned from. As you know, there were few Asians, a few minorities, but it was really amazing to bring together people from so many walks of life. If I may ask, Tommy, tell us about you. What brought you to the Center for Compassion, and what brought you into this whole field of lifelong learning about compassion and caring for each other?
I'm smiling throughout your entire introduction because this interview is extraordinary, because I don't think I've ever been interviewed in any formal way for social media. I've watched tons of social media, but I've never been the subject of social media. So I'm just laughing at the idea of me being interviewed. But I'm very happy to do it with you, Shankar, because I've always admired you, and I'm glad we're able to reconnect. In regards to who I am, how much time do you have?
Oh, the good news is this: because we're on social media, there are no time limits. So some people
Oh,
talk 20 minutes, some people talk for 2 hours. And the good news is that people who watch this, they have the liberty of forwarding, skipping, or coming back to it.
oh, that's
So there's
true.
no time
They can
limit.
delete it. They can delete
And
it.
we can even edit it later if there's a need, because if we want to
Oh,
focus on some
okay.
things. So it's a free flow. It's literally a free flow.
Yeah, because what I've learned is that as I've aged, I turned 70 on July 8th. And what I've learned in the last 5 years is that my mind is constantly curating my life. And I assume that part of acquiring wisdom or producing wisdom is that after you've lived such a long life, if one stays healthy and can review one's life for all the memories and all uh, the the good things that happen, as well as the challenging things that happen. If you're able to look at all that, stand back and look at it, then you can curate uh, a lifetime experience and draw wisdom from it. Um, so I constantly find myself curating my life, and after 70 years, a brief introduction seems um, uh, uh, unrealistic, but I'm going to try to keep it short, as short as I can. I have been introducing myself at different events in two ways, because I realize that I have a different impact if I give you one introduction versus another, and I'm going to demonstrate. So when I go to different kinds of meetings, people are impressed because they will read or hear that Tommy Lee Woon has been working as a multicultural educator and administrator at several elite institutions in the United States at dean level positions that include Stanford University, Dartmouth College, Brown University, Oberlin College, and Macalester College, and Naropa University, which is probably the only school founded by a Buddhist monk. And not only did I have an appointment at Stanford, but I was appointed twice for two different positions, 10 years apart. And I also worked in Dartmouth and Stanford medical schools doing some work. So when I introduced myself that way, in one audience where I started doing this with Alaskan natives who invited me to do a workshop on historical trauma and healing it, when I was introduced that way, I said, now, let me introduce myself in a different way. And I said, I am a son of illegal immigrants who came in the 1880s, who hid and fled. I'm a first generation college student who hated school, absolutely hated school, because of the strict parenting and expectation that I would go to college. I made it through college. I left school. I was suicidal because I felt ashamed that I was doing so poorly. I did manage to graduate, but I'm proud of the Asian American movement, which was part of the huge movement, civil rights movement in the 60s. And the civil rights movement moved from the streets onto college campuses. As it's happening now, as we talk, things on the street are going to the campuses when students go back. But I was part of that and contributed to helping to create Asian American Studies. But even then, I was suicidal and left school. Wasn't sure I was gonna do it. Married and divorced, clinically depressed for over a year, and very lost, and had lots of feelings of inadequacy, and I managed to climb out of it and managed to start working at all these prestigious institutions. And in every way, I felt like I went through the back door. I accepted positions initially that no one wanted. And I was not paid really well, even for these positions. And I also got involved with a grassroots, radical, Marxist peer counseling program that I was involved with for 22 years. It was all based on human beings are good. When we get hurt, if we are able to discharge our feelings, laugh, cry, and shake, and rage, and do that in a sustained way with partners in peer counseling for free, and we use that to overcome oppression. I did that and led that for 22 years. No one knows about it today. It went all over the world. It was a movement and not a professional healing program. And so when you asked how did I get to the Center for to learn compassion training with you, while I was at Stanford doing my multicultural education diversity work, I started learning how to heal trauma in the body. And there was a 3-year training program. I was fascinated by it. I wanted to look at how to apply it towards healing historical trauma, racism, and other oppressions in the body and in society. And when I heard about it from a friend, Angela Waldron, first woman of color, an Indian woman who went to Stanford and got a PhD in engineering. she had applied for the program and was rejected, but she was a mentor of mine. And she told me about it. I applied and I got in, and we still talk about that. And so you and I were in the first class of 50 of people trained in teaching compassion meditation through a scientific lens, as we were told. And so that's how you and I met. Yes.
Yeah, and
and then wait. And so when I asked people in that audience, how did the first introduction touch you, and how did the second introduction touch you? And the first gentleman who answered raised his hand, and he said, Tommy, I heard the first introduction, I was ready to walk out of the room because I felt like I had nothing. I couldn't identify with you. But the second introduction, I felt like you were my brother.
So you had asked me the question earlier.
Introduce myself that way. I just wanted to introduce myself that way, that I have lived an amazing life that I never planned or expected. Everything seemed to be accidental. Yes.
You had asked me that question earlier. Why do you want to interview me? Why do you want to have a conversation with me? And this is why. Often we get obsessed with the external resume. Often we get, we almost get, we totally fall for the external resume. Millions of dollars and success and Stanford University and this and that. But what is not known is that the amount of anguish we suffer, that we are all human. Whether Jim Doty, the founder of the Center for Compassion, talking about his dysfunctional family, living in orphanages, living through, what are those called, unsettling experiences multiple times. That's the reality. There's hardly anybody who just ends up with a nice curated resume. That's for the rest of the world. The marketing piece. And the way sausages are made are not exactly the way they are advertised, right? So we are all human sausages. We are all humans who have gone through life. And so I always look for the inner resume or the challenges. You and I never really talked about that when we were in class as much. I was quite vocal about the challenges I faced, but not everybody was as vocal. And this is my way of hearing the inner side of the story,
Well, and when I was at Stanford, my second appointment, my job was to create an office to serve first generation college students at Stanford. And we would invite speakers who were faculty and prominent people who were themselves first generation college students. And this one professor who was young, he spoke and told the students, once you come from that background, no matter where you are, how far you go, you never forget. And it's true. I never forget. And I'm extremely proud of my heritage. And being part of the real world, right? Part of what so many people live. This part of living in an ivory tower is not real. It's constructed in a way to create a hierarchy that allows us to have certain benefits, but those benefits don't always reach the people who were like me. I was fortunate and able to get into the system, because of diversity positions where there weren't many people doing these jobs because they were treated as ghettoized jobs that led to no future. Ironically, I kept riding the wave of that put me in jobs that other people didn't want. And these jobs have now grown into another professional hierarchical category. So that troubles me in some regards.
So interestingly, what I found fascinating when we were at the Center for Compassion was the diversity of experiences that people brought to the table. I think I was the only engineer who had finally found my way into the compassion world in our room. There are many doctors, there are many nurses, many people from other healing professions. So I never asked you about your ethnicity. You mentioned that your parents came to the United States illegally and stuff. I'm very curious. Where did they come from? Like in my case, I came through the engineering route because America was always looking for engineers, and I stepped in. As simple as that, from India.
Well, I love the opportunity of being able to talk about the history of Asian migration, Asians also being settlers, not colonizers, but we have to acknowledge that we are settlers on native land. So even though we were illegal, we were made illegal by the colonizers, the white colonizers. But my great-grandfather, I had three of them who I think went to the United States in the 1880s. 1882, the United States enacted the first Exclusion Act to block the entry of any group. The Chinese were the targets. And so my great-grandfather was part of the wave of Chinese migrants who bought fake papers, and they were called paper sons. And they would come in with papers that authorized them to be with a parent who was already in the United States. And so from 1882 to 1943, when China went to war with Japan and became an ally of the United States, for 60 years, over 60 years, Chinese people were excluded. In the 1850s, during the gold rush in California, 1850s, I think California wasn't even a state, or maybe it just become a state. But in 1855, there were about 55,000 people in California. 5,000 were Chinese. They were 10% of the population. They are not 10% of California right now. There's 60 years of exclusion. So my great-grandparents came in, my fathers came in as single men, sojourners, who lived in Chinatowns under apartheid conditions, discriminated against and harassed, separated from family members for long periods of time. Some of them never were able to go back to China. So he brought his son, my grandfather, over, and then my grandfather had a family in the United States, so my father was born. And then they went back to China with the intention of going home. There was no intention of staying because we were unwelcome. So eventually my grandfather went back to China in 1929 or so. And then in 1937, when the war with Japan broke out, he was able to come back with his illegal papers. And he came back with my father. In 1949, after the war, they were to return. My father and mother had an arranged marriage. And when they came to the United States in 49, I was born in 1950. right after the Communist Revolution. So my family came to the United States and started to settle in a more permanent way. Now, this part of my heritage is really important and completely overlooked. I am from a group of people called Khoisan people. It is a subgroup of ethnic group of Cantonese people. We're from a county, primarily peasants and farm workers, and we spoke a dialect of Chinese that is ridiculed. And so I'm a descendant of Khoisan people. And Khoisan people were the first people to leave China in the 1800s in large waves because of the colonialism and war and famine going on in China. And because Khoisan was in the south and near the seas and ocean, they were able to get on ships and travel the world. People of my heritage probably started every Chinatown in the world.
Wow.
But do you ever hear of Khoisan people? You hear the term Toisan, which is the Cantonese word. But recently in the last, because of social media, young Khoisan people are reclaiming our names, our identities, our language, our culture. But we were the ones who built the Transcontinental Railroad that connected the East and West, that allowed for industrial materials to be transported across the and sold. And the Khoisan people were the farm workers that helped clear the land to build the levees in the central heart of California that produces massive amounts of food for the world. So we were there during exclusion and laws. Hundreds of laws were imposed on us. Ridiculous laws like taxes for using a pole and a basket instead of a horse and a cart to carry laundry. So I'm part of that group that you never hear about. You never hear about them. We're the early ones who helped to build America. And there were people who fought in World War II, and on and on. And that's so much of that is being reclaimed through different pockets of people who have the resources now and the education to retrieve all that. And even in China, they don't recognize it. So when I went to Nanjing University last year and spoke at a peacebuilding conference, I was invited to speak about my work, and I turned it into a eulogy for my ancestors. And I kept repeating, just because I said, my ancestors left China, but they never forgot China. The Chinese Revolution with Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the Republic, would not have happened without my ancestors. They protected him in the United States. They funded him, and he was able to come back and resurrect his revolution and to end the dynastic rule, which then led to the Communist Revolution. And so that wouldn't have happened without Khoisan people taking care of Sun Yat-sen. So as you can hear in my voice, my determination to honor them. And when I went to Nanjing University, I gave that history, and I said, just because my ancestors left China, they did not forget China, even if China forgot them. And I was in front of C9 students, which is the Ivy Leagues of China. Them and faculty and people from different parts of Asia were there for Peacebuilding Institute, and I gave a eulogy, and I was crying because I was bringing my ancestors' spirits home And the Chinese immigrants believed in a saying, when dead leaves fall, you know, they go to the ground. No, when grass is cut, separated from roots, they die. When dead leaves fall, they go into the ground, and seeds fall, they plant new roots. And so these are kinds of philosophies and poems that are written on the walls of Angel Island and places like that characterize how they felt. They wanted to come home. I actually feel that I stayed alive long enough to reconnect with China because my ancestors are waiting for one of us to go home, to take their ancestors home. Last year was one of taking ancestors home. My wife, who is Korean Japanese, had a grandmother who was taken to Japan during the war, and she never went home. She participated in the first uprising to protest Japanese colonization. She was taken to Japan, lived her life there. My wife learned that March 1st of 2019 was the 100th celebration of the uprising that her grandmother was at. We went to Korea to take her grandmother's spirit home because she never was able to go home. My wife left some hair and some fingernails in the riverbank to return her grandmother's DNA. So last year was a time of honoring our ancestors and taking them home.
Wow, that's so fascinating. I mean, the closest I had heard about why so many people from China were brought either voluntarily or by force or by deception to the United States was they said certain groups of people in China were very hardy and they had certain ways of living. They cook their own food, even if they were working, on the railroad, they'd cook their own food and make sure they was transported, so they never fell sick. So this certain group of people from China never fell sick, and they would survive in the harshest conditions, and therefore they were used to build this long railroad, transcontinental railroad from East Coast to the West Coast, and so on. And I thought that was fascinating. And in my naive mind, I generalized it to mean pretty much anybody from China, but now I know better. So it was the Hoisan people.
Well, and when we're talked about, even among other Chinese people, we were just peasants, but I realized probably 10 years ago, I thought, actually, my ancestors were craftsmen, they were skilled farmers, they were fishermen, they were artists, they were Kung Fu experts. They were I met a Kung Fu master here who's from my parents' village. And he said, I'm not college educated, but I'm cultured. Which gets to what you and I have been talking about, that just because you don't have a degree or pedigree that brands you, doesn't mean that you don't have talents and capacities, skills, and wisdom. And to assume that workers, don't have anything. This Kung Fu master was an acupuncturist. He was a Kung Fu master. He was a Qigong teacher. He was an artist, and he was an artist, and he was a chef. And he was excelled at all those things. So if you looked at him and these people who came and assumed that, they didn't represent anything, some of them were shamans and healers using Chinese medicinal medicine. Those stories have all been obliterated. There was a Chinese touch healer who spent years in Oregon healing white people. they have a museum and they found all his herbs there. So most of us who grew up here, we don't know these things. We just assume that we were very humble, ordinary beings that didn't have anything of value other than to be exploited as workers. And that's just not true. And we also had an ethic of my friend Valerie Carr, the daughter of a third generation Sikh American. She framed something, revolutionary love, as labor. And all of a sudden I thought, I grew up not seeing romantic love. My parents had an arranged marriage. And I thought, Asian love is not based on individualistic flirtations and romance. It's based on labor. It's expressed through dedication and sacrifice to your family and children and to work. And so it doesn't have this emotional kind of performance to it. Certainly it's there, but it's not openly displayed. Anybody who acts acts flirtatious in a community where arranged marriage is happening is then called a barbarian. And with your parents will arrange your marriage to someone who's a male barbarian and to a woman, or and this is the world of heterosexism. So there's not even, I thought of a novel once, writing a novel of where a Chinese father who is gay and has an arranged marriage grows up and his son is gay, and he arranges a marriage for his son to another man. It's a way of promoting gay liberation in Chinese thinking. But now that's a distraction anyway.
Earlier, before we started this conversation, you used the word epistemicide, and that was the first time I even understood what it meant. There are so many ways of knowing, and school, college have legitimized or given a certificate to certain ways of knowing. For example, when I was in engineering school, the reason I was admired was because I was good at math and logic and English or languages. And that was the right thing to do, right? To be able to calculate faster than computers. There were no hi-fi computers in those days. To be able to do quick analysis of situations and come up with quick wit, that was considered the right way to success. But what got removed from that, even in basic education, was the ability to empathize, the ability to care for someone, the ability to sing or dance, the ability to play sports. There's so many other, if you even the theory of multiple intelligences, 90% of the other intelligence are completely ignored. If what you wanted was a career, say in engineering or business or medicine or the so-called glamorous or law, even today that's the case. So as an educator who worked at Stanford, what do you feel about that? I mean, it is a form of epistemicide, right? Where we are actually removing away major aspects of our personality and of our culture and giving preference to only certain aspects. And because it serves us.
I'd like to speak to the harm of epistemicide and its invisibility. It's become normalized. It becomes normalized. Every society that rules in a one-dimensional way rather than a pluralistic way is practicing epistemicide. What is epistemicide? How is it normalized? It's normalized through microaggressions. It's daily harm, death by 1,000 cuts, and it's unseen but but you're harmed. And so when you're forced to learn English only, that's epistemicide. When you're reducing knowledge to when you only make evidence-based knowledge through reductionist science truth, that's epistemicide. We both know that ways of knowing. I remember watching a Mongolian talk about a young Mongolian doctor talking about choosing whether to go to Western medical school after he was admitted, or to a Mongolian medical school. And he said Westerners think that an Asian system of knowing, which doesn't use laboratories to test, to create evidence about practices and disease and things like that. He said, Mongolian doctors meet every year. They share their information. They vet it, they test it, they analyze it, they come to agreements. So there is a way of evaluating. And the reality is, we all have the ability to evaluate wisdom. If someone pronounces something and the person has credibility and you test it and it doesn't work for you, well, that's evidence. And it turns out, evidence-based medicine is highly subjective because it's based on what do you choose to study and how do you choose to study it. And there's flaws in all the studies. As someone who's living and surviving cancer, I know that, science is often appropriated by capitalism, and they market all kinds of things as working when they don't. And they hide certain things. Now, there's a lot of regulation to try to make things honest and transparent, but it's imperfect. And so there's no system of knowledge that's perfect. And to separate knowledge that comes from wisdom, from experience, from thousands of years of tests, is to practice epistemicide. And so when you rule out in any way someone's opinion about something without considering it in a humble way as may be worthy of consideration, you're practicing epistemicide. And here's an illustration of how it impacts our bodies, because my work is about alarms in our body. When I work with indigenous people of America, when I do workshops on bias, unconscious bias, and how I illustrate epistemicide this way, I open the workshop by saying, what's your name? Where are you from? What's your tribe? And what's your nation? Now, these are all white people, and they fumble with my tribe. You mean my ethnicity? Oh, well, I'm Irish, I'm Danish, I'm Norwegian, I'm Polish. What do you mean? I don't explain why I asked for tribe. And then after I do the introductions, then I'll do a ceremony where I ask for permission from the elders and ancestors of the land in which we're doing the workshop for permission to speak. It's rhetorical, but it's symbolic. For permission to speak, I thank them for permission to speak. And then I'll do some other ceremony, usually with Native partners who lead it and who consent to this. And then when I'm done, I will ask, when you went to school, did you start classes by saluting the flag or singing the Star Spangled Banner. And most people of different ages say, yes, all right, we salute the flag. I said, I went to school, we salute the flag every day in grade school, elementary school. I said, imagine a Native American, an indigenous person for whom estimated 90 million people were killed, coming to your school and saluting the flag to pledge allegiance to the country that almost exterminated them, leaving them with about 5 million today. Imagine how that feels in that child's mind and body to have to do that every day. And so when you disqualify that child from saying my name and my tribe as a way of getting to know each other, and having ceremony as a way of learning, and sitting in a circle and getting to know each other before. I went through school, I don't remember any personal introduction throughout all my years of school, into graduate school. Well, later in my counseling classes, but no real introduction. That is not relational learning. That is not a pedagogy that is inclusive. So right there, what is normalized, death by 1,000 cuts, begins with how we set the tone in school, and we accept it as normal. And we don't even know that it's epistemicide. And so then when people rely on those normalized practices and values of science and how you teach and how you learn, and tell you that the way that you want to learn is nonsense, that is epistemicide. And it's a death by 1,000 cuts that marginalizes other people who don't fit in that culture. And then we expect people from those marginalized cultures to perform well enough to graduate when most of the time our bodies are resisting and rebelling and trying to vomit what you're forced to learn.
In fact, one of the things that I'm reminded of, Tommy, was that this emphasis on binary classification. If in the court of law, for example, when somebody goes to testify, they're asked to say, are you saying yes or are you saying no? And the truth may be it's neither 100% yes or 100% no. Did you see it or did you not see it? Well, I saw something and I'm not sure. That's not considered an appropriate answer because we have this binary way of thinking. And I don't know when that started happening. I'm sure it's pretty antiquated. But this morning I was talking to a friend when I said, why should the opposite of good be bad? Why should the opposite of true be false? The opposite of good can be something that I'm not sure is good. And could be a whole lot of things. Why should the opposite of white be black? When there are a whole bunch of colors. I'll give you an example of where that becomes significant. If you ask the question, what is the opposite of Muslim in America, the answer is likely to be Christian. And if you ask that question in India, what do you think the answer will be? Hindu. And if you ask that question in Israel, the answer will be different. So who says it's opposites? There are many nuances, and Islam is not just one tribe. Speaking of tribes, there are multiple practices within Islam. There are multiple practices. Hinduism has got 1,000 different practices. Even within Christianity, there are so many denominations, not just one, Lutheran or Episcopal or the Church of the Latter-day Saints, and of course Catholic and many others. So the idea of opposites and binary is so reductionist. Even when it comes to like, is this medicine good or not? Should you use Clorox or should you not? should you use Lysol or should you not? The idea that it's either good or bad, I think it has bifurcated the world in ways that were just not. It doesn't make sense to me. What do you think? Because in the East, in Asia in particular, or same thing in many other countries, this bifurcation is not binary.
Yes, I completely agree, and I would sort of explain it in that we're not reductionists, we're integrative. We don't believe simply in independence, we believe in interdependence. And so there's a Stanford psychologist named Hazel Marcus who writes this book called Clash. And she says, do we have a clashing of independence and interdependence? In the West, individualism is highly treasured. And what we see playing out in the United States is this fight to protect our rights, our freedom, our liberties, to be who we are, when we want to be, to completely have control over our rights. What individualists fail to see is that they are part of a group of individualists. And they think everyone else is into group politics, and, you know, but actually individualists are a group. They just, you know, they all conspire to fight for their individualism. Other groups happen to fight for other things in group-oriented ways. But for me, you know, we need a blend. I'm all about pluralism, and the world does not know how to live with pluralism. So we reduce it. We reduce everything in one way so we can control. Pluralism seems difficult to control. There's this fear that as we support pluralism, it means we support lots of subcultures. And when we support an expanding number of subcultures, so let's just take the gay community. First it was gay, then it was lesbian gay, then it's bisexual, then it's transgender, then it's queer, then it's gender free. And you know, this DNA, this chain for being not cisgender just keeps growing. And when, you know, and so there's this fear, like if we open the doors to one, it'll escalate and cascade and lead to more, and we won't be able to control it. So there's a fear that there's a
centrifugal force that will pull us apart if we keep supporting diversity. The solution gets into the binary. So the solution is, well, let's compress and force, let's out of many one, let's melt. But the melting always ends up being white on top in the United States and color on the bottom. So it's assimilationist, and it's not multicultural. It's not a melting pot. No one, we melt unequally. So then when we draw us together in a centripetal force, the opposite of centrifugal, then we squeeze out the diversity and we lose all that diversity. So we need to learn to be an accordion where we go in and out and we're fluid. So the binary is ended by being integrative in fluid, and that yin-yang symbol is not binary, good, bad. Yin-yang is fluid, it's integrative. It's one is related to the other, one transforms the other. It's always moving. And the line in the middle, the yin-yang symbol, is the mediator for that. And so then, you know, people misinterpret the yin-yang symbol as also supporting, but the binary, the most serious binary that we know, Christians' views of good and evil. Whereas in Asia, Buddhism, there is no God and there's no good or evil.
That's true. Everything is nuanced.
And everything is nuanced and everything is integrative. And enlightenment is not being attached. And when you're not attached to anything, you give up greed, but you're open. And you're open to everything being fluid and interactive. And there's room for individualism too, as long as you recognize individuals also a group, and they can become very rigid about fighting for just individualism. So you have to be able to see these nuances, right?
Interestingly, it was Nagarjuna who pointed out, probably in the 6th century AD, Nagarjuna was a Buddhist scholar from southern India, and he said that we cannot, if you strictly go by the idea of detachment, you cannot be attached to the doctrine of detachment either. The moment you get attached to the doctrine of detachment, you're attached. So now what should you do? So he brought out many of these things about, you cannot have absolutes, but that statement itself cannot be an absolute, that you cannot have absolutes.
I think not having absolutes is frightening for people. And that gets to how did we learn to be so alarmed, and how does that live in our bodies? And how do we free ourselves of these alarms so that we can handle challenges without being over-alarmed?
Yeah, which brings me to what we are facing today. Now you mentioned at a global level, we are facing a pandemic, and there's still debate going on whether the virus is real or not, whether the pandemic is real or not. But what we are seeing is a lot of suffering. We are seeing a lot of people losing lives or getting really sick with a kind of pneumonia that we haven't seen before, and whether or not a mask will protect. So again, for the first time, even in America, there are no binary decisions being taken. It's almost impossible to have binary decisions. Should there be a lockdown or should there not be a lockdown? Should kids go to school or not? So many, this yes, no answers are not happening anymore. So fuzzy logic is what is prevailing, whether we like it or not, isn't it?
Well, I think you heard my answer to sort of the question of how we can coexist. And at the heart of the matter is what the Sikhs have said, that we should see no stranger. How do we learn to see no stranger? So in my meditation that I've started, there's designing. I start by teaching breaths together for a change. And I start by inviting people to learn the traditional silent breath meditation just for a few minutes. And then I transform the silent breath meditation to, now let's return to imagining your first breaths after you were born, where you saw no stranger. We were all born seeing no stranger. We accept nurturing and love from any being that comes to us. Take those breaths and feel your mother's presence, those breaths together with mother and family, where there was no stranger. And breathe in and out and start learning to sense others' breaths and not just your own. Feel that in your body. Remember that, how you did that as a baby. Feel your face on the chest of your mother. Feel your face on the chest of your father. Feel your chest on relatives while ancestors are watching. Feel breaths together for a change when you saw no stranger. Feel breaths together with your mother handing you to a racially different woman who could also be your mother. And if you are not alarmed, you have no problem seeing her as also your mother, and you will see no stranger. When you start to feel rattled that someone is a stranger, that is when you start to acquire bias. Now, the psychologists will immediately say, Tommy, there's developmental psychology theory. After 2 years of life, children will get startled and react to strange faces. I say, yes, let me answer that. I'm asking myself the question of the critics, and I would say, and I'll say, after 2 years of life, we start to be able to perceive, because we have the physical structures and the brain structures to discern and to discriminate. And so when we notice something unfamiliar, we start to develop caution. And then as soon as we are told, this is your uncle that you've never met, and then you watch your family members enjoy your uncle's company, and your alarm goes off. So when the alarms come on and you're able to discern, it's at those moments when you start to acquire a rational alarm system, a healthy alarm system. And when you're told some people are in groups and out groups, then your alarm stays on towards the stranger. So yes, we get startled. Yes, we start to cry because of the face, but it's part of the development of our ability to recognize danger. But it doesn't mean that we're trapped in seeing one group as the stranger and another as not. You know, it is part of the developmental process to develop our capacity to know. And as long as we are offered healthy models and we learn no strangers exist, actually, they might be new, but a new person is not should be a distrusted stranger. So my meditations on breaths together for a change, creating a world of feeling and seeing no stranger, you know, addresses what you're saying about the crisis in our time. This is a historical crisis where we have decided good and evil is normal. And I'm saying good and evil is not normal. It is a misinterpretation based on not understanding what happened when we were mis-socialized into systems and cultures that saw in-groups and out-groups. But if we re-socialize and reset those alarms, it is possible to have a world of seeing no strangers.
Wow, wow. You simplified it so much for me. In India, we have a lot of stray dogs. And right now I'm visiting India, and we have a lot of dogs on the streets. And they show that anybody that comes from outside their territory is an alien for them. And they will bark. That's their job. They have to bark. And we know that they're not using the prefrontal cortex of the rational mind when they're barking. They are actually going by reptilian and limbic symbols. In other words, safety first.
Yes.
Somebody is here that I don't know and I'm not happy about it. Like, wow, wow, wow. And then all the dogs from that in group will start barking. And they will they'll try to push that new person out, whether it's a human being or it's another animal, until they realize they cannot. Then they reconcile with it. They may reconcile through fear, which is acceptance through fear, which is again based on the lower levels of the mind, or the stranger is not shouting at them, the stranger is not stealing, the stranger is not doing anything which they consider as dangerous, then they're like, okay, maybe it's not a bad animal after all, whether it's a human being or another animal. And they accept. It takes 3 or 4 times, and they accept. So even dogs that don't have as sophisticated a prefrontal cortex as we do, or even a cortex for that matter, learn how to reconcile with strangers. It's funny that we don't always do that.
So we have institutionalized in our body that there are strangers. We're trained that way, we grew up that way. There's in groups and out groups. And you know, our bodies, our reptilian brain, as you said, will react with alarm, and that alarm won't go off. It's always on towards certain groups of people. So we're seeing that played out. Back to COVID. So in Chinese history, there's this belief that when rulers have been corrupt and put their interests ahead of the welfare of the people, that they will lose the mandate of heaven. And when they lose the mandate of heaven, you will have natural disasters and catastrophes. So the eruption of hurricanes, multiplying the earth, you know, vibrating and showing its displeasure, with earthquakes and fires and hurricanes and COVID, and it's all coalescing. That's a signal for, in ancient China, for the people, to give people permission to rebel against the rulers who are corrupt. We have had, it's a nice legend that is useful right now, because it is so true that we have corruption all over the world with rulers who have not learned to lead with their hearts. And as a result, you know, they have betrayed the people they served, and they have lost the mandate of heaven, and we have the right to rebel. And so, unfortunately, the rebellions have costs. They become violent because they become power struggles between those in power and their agents and in their enforcers against people. And the people rebelling don't always rebel non-violently. And that's a danger, because then when they win, they then do not know how to lead with hearts either. So how do you rebel with heart? And that's where I would suggest something like Revolutionary Love from Valerie Carr. How do you rebel with heart and see no stranger? How do you see your enemy as not a stranger? She went into the prison to see the man who murdered her uncle, and to reach out and talk to him, as well as to talk to other people like that. So she models that. She has lived that. She's only 38 years old. But she points the way for how we overcome those alarms. It takes great courage. It creates a labor of love, as she says, and pushing. She uses the mother's, she uses childbirth and parenting, mothering, to describe the pathway of a labor, of intense labor, being pregnancy, birthing a new world. That the womb, this darkness that we're living in, is this the darkness of a tomb, or is it the darkness of a womb to rebirth a world? And in order to do that, we have to labor with love in a sustained way, and we have to keep pushing. And it takes courageous compassion. which is something that wasn't highlighted in our training. And so, the work I'm doing is to highlight courageous compassion. And because the Buddha wanted to see suffering end. Oh, and the Dalai Lama has talked about anger. He said that it wouldn't be rational not to be angry at injustice. Now that gets downplayed in the West. We have appropriated the tranquilization meditations, but not the courageous
That's true.
meditations and suffering through action. There are groups that are doing it, but it is not as normalized in the West. And I'm not even sure it's normalized in the East, but I haven't lived really in the East, so I don't know.
Well, what is really glamorized is calming meditations and finding ways to calm the turbulence of the mind. But it is also known, for example, in one of the methods like Vipassana or in the Yoga Sutras, that to be able to find the tranquility of the mind, we have to face the demons. We cannot just suppress the negativities or what they call unwholesome feelings, whether it's anger or it's fear. Pema Chodron, a Western monk, describes it very beautifully in her work about what is it called, the places that you fear to go, or the methods of Tonglen, for example, which we are referred to, the Tibetan method of Tonglen, which is taking in what we consider as evil or taking in what we consider as negative or unwholesome and breathing out fresh air. We are almost forcing the idea of acceptance of what is unpleasant, but nevertheless we are trying to encounter what is unpleasant. So I hope the idea of just do Om and everything will go away. It's too oversimplified. It's like, oh, get rid of all the negatives. And there are prayers that say, get rid of all the negatives and just be positive. There's the whole law of attraction tribe now going after getting rid of all negatives and just going positive. Just be happy, don't worry, be happy. It's oversimplified. But the truth is nuanced, and particularly finding tranquility of the mind means accepting grief and accepting the fact that there are unpleasant states of the mind, unpleasant not only states of the mind, unpleasant traits that have become deeply entrenched, addictions, cravings, aversions that are deeply entrenched, and we have to face them. We cannot just escape them. And that's why, whether it's a meditation practice or it's a socializing practice, these habit patterns, what I think a very simplistic way they describe it in Asia is first there are the sensations and then you have the feelings. But then from the feelings come emotions and thoughts. Your thoughts and emotions about feelings and thoughts also. So that's how it gets like a tapestry, a web. And then these thoughts and emotions create moods. And the moods eventually become temperament. So to be able to deal with feelings, we have to understand that we have different temperaments. Like when I used to see you in the class, you were the quieter types, and I would assume that everything is perfect in your life, but that's an assumption. And somebody would look at Shankar, oh, but this is not right and that is not right, protesting and questioning and, being loud and vociferous sometimes. And people would think, oh, Shankar is always a disturbed person because my temperament is to question very quickly, almost impulsively. And therefore it is considered as unwholesome by a lot of people. So yeah, I mean, the truth is, even when it comes to mood and neural disorders or mental health, is very nuanced. The DSM-5 is a very oversimplified model, and I think people are realizing that. It's not like somebody's just narcissistic personality disorder and put the president in that category, or somebody else would say, has high self-esteem. So those are the binary classifications. So, but again, what you said earlier about epistemicide, which is getting rid of other ways of looking at things, has really made our entire lifestyle, education system, the way we even treat, say, marriage and divorce, for example, the way we live our lives has been binary for too long, isn't it? In ancient India, even there wasn't a rigid marriage system. We see that among tribals in India. I've been spending a lot of time with tribals. The woman got to choose who she wanted to have a baby with. And once that was done, she may choose to have a baby with another man. And that was not looked down upon, that was considered perfectly normal by many tribes, even today. And the Indian government fortunately allows that. They don't insist on a marriage certificate, and the paternity is not fixed in for certain tribes. But we have oversimplified too many things, or rigidified too many things, isn't it?
Yeah.
You worked with many people, and your work was about working with diversity and inclusion. So you probably actually encountered all kinds of oversimplifications and gross, almost what do you call, rigid classifications.
Yeah, I started my career primarily working with Asian American students. I grew up in a Black Asian neighborhood, and English was my second language, and child of immigrants. So I've been bicultural and then over time exposed to many cultures and identities. And so I built relationships with many, many different people. And so I didn't live in one lane, one bubble, one channel, which allowed me to see things, broadly. Sometimes it got very lonely because people, I think it can be more comforting to stay within one community. But I think what helped me was that I did reclaim my pride in my own heritage and my own community. So that allowed me to go to other groups. And going into other groups didn't mean that I would lose my identity. It would mean it would enrich my human experience. So I think being anchored in who you are and your own culture and history is important. Otherwise, you can get lost in other groups. You can get lost in your other groups. There's more there, but I'll just stop there.
You remind me of the time, 1987, when I first migrated to the United States. And when I was in India, we were told again and again that we are surrounded by enemies, and particularly Pakistan. And Pakistan was like an enemy because it was an Islamic state, whereas India was on paper a secular state. And there was that fighting all the time. But there was China on the other side, and that was also a potential enemy state because they had taken a bit of India and stolen away parts of India in 1962. So, what is interesting is that with all the cultural commonalities between India and Pakistan, and India and China, and Pakistan and China, and so on, we saw them as natural enemies. So, I come to the United States, to Iowa, Des Moines, Iowa, which had basically only 80 Indians total out of a population of 160,000. And most of the people, sorry?
There are more now.
Oh, there are many more now. There was not even an Indian restaurant in the entire state of Iowa in 1987. And now there's a yoga studio practically in every town. So yeah, America is much more accepting of plurality, or you know, than it was in those days. It was just a historical coincidence that there were only 80 or so in the entire city, the capital city, Des Moines of Iowa. And so I was looking for comfort with my own culture. And somebody said, there's a bunch of Pakistani people I know, and they're really good people. And go talk to them. And this was my Indian friends, because they were in school with us here and they've now moved to Des Moines and they're really good people. Go give it a shot. So I go very nervously, and they give me amazing biryani. And no, at that time I think I said I wanted to not eat meat, and they make veggie biryani, and like the right level of spice and all. And then we talk in Hindi, Urdu, which is again, they're considered separate languages, but they're not. There's so much overlap between Hindi and Urdu that they're like joined at the hip, with both Arabic as well as Sanskrit roots, but they're joined at the hip. But it was hilarious, and we were watching Bollywood movies. We were watching movies that are made in India, and we were talking about drama that is done in Pakistan. So after about meeting them 2 or 3 times and avoiding politics, because the moment we talked about politics, all hell would break loose. So I became friends with them. And a year later, I ended up a few months later, I ended up proposing to a woman, and we did get married, and we're still married. But the way I did it, I was too nervous.
Did
Sorry?
you marry? Did you marry a Pakistani?
No, no, no. I married a person from India, but from the state of Kashmir. No, she was very much Indian by birth. But what was interesting was I was so nervous about proposing that I told her I learned 3 new Chinese words, which I learned, which ones they would be. Why ni? So, and she was like, what are those 3 new Chinese words? And this is all over the phone because she was in a different city. And then, like I told her, wo I ni. She asked 3 different people, what does wo mean? What does I mean? And what does ni mean? And like, okay, she figured it out. So the funny thing was that what was initially alien, what was initially enemy cultures, if you will, for lack of a better, you have to be careful with those Chinese, you have to be careful with those Pakistanis, ended up becoming not only friendly, but we started embracing it. And lo and behold, at the individual level, even proposing in Chinese, because to get over my nervousness, I didn't want to propose and get rejected in my own language. So it was easier to say something new. I learned a new phrase, as a linguistic gimmick. But what shifted for me was the love of cultures and the pluralism of cultures. And I can now say hello in 75 languages. I didn't end up learning many languages. I only learned Espanol when I was stranded for 3 months in Mexico at the beginning of this pandemic. So I learned Spanish. I didn't have a choice, and I learned it pretty good. But and I know many languages of India. But what is interesting was to be able to even respect people by greeting them in their native language shifted me in a big way. And have you seen that about yourself, Tommy? Because you worked with people literally from different cultures in your career and in your neighborhood, right?
What's interesting is that because I've been exposed to so many different cultures, when I meet somebody, I can communicate culturally with them. So I didn't realize how much exposure I had to Native Americans. And then I started being invited to Alaska. I have weekly meetings with two Native American women, and they're working with me on developing meditations to heal historical trauma that they want to take to their tribes. And they're young, but as I talk to them, I'm constantly able to reference what I've learned in the past from other natives. I'll say, did you know that this whole felt sense idea of if you could feel it in your body, then it makes a difference. So there's scientific research. Eugene Gendlin, who invented felt sense at the University of Chicago, said the people who benefited from psychotherapy were people who could feel things changing in their bodies. And then Peter Levine took it and expanded it, the felt sense, into the regulation of the reptilian brain to heal trauma. And then I point out, well, Buddha knew all this stuff. But then I discovered from a Native American friend from decades ago, he said, my father taught me, it was oral tradition and wisdom and healing. My father advocated that if you feel it, you heal it. And I thought, this is an old, ancient idea from indigenous people. Because I point out, I said, again, Westerners all of a sudden go into the body and the experience of the body, and then have to use the anatomy and physiology of the reptilian brain and the autonomic nervous system to explain that it's useful to go in the body and that it works. And it's like, well, we knew that. If you feel it, you heal it. And if you meditate and sense and are aware of all the things happening in your body, and you notice them and you become detached from them, then that'll help you to be calm and healthy. We knew all that for thousands of years, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
in fact, they talk about the energy centers, whether it's the qi in Chinese, traditional Chinese medicine,
yeah.
or prana in the Asia medicine, the language of Sanskrit in South Asia. In both cases, they talk about multiple energy centers, whether they call it chakras or they call it meridians. Now it's been kind of incorporated into the idea of in chiropractic as well as in physiotherapy. The idea that all thinking or all decision making is done in the brain is actually flawed, and we now know that. But that was never, nobody in Asia ever, or even in Africa, nobody thought of all full, you to fix the brain and everything else will be fixed. That was not assumed. In Asia, we know that for a fact because we always talked about gut feelings, or what's known as the hara chakra, the hara in Japan, harakiri, or the gut. And also we talked about the heart. If you remember the story, when electrodes were being placed on the monks' brains to understand their brain state, and they started laughing. You're learning comparison and you want to just check the brain? You should be checking the heart and the brain. The mana, or the idea that the heart mind is not just localized in the brain, but it's also in the heart. And it took a long time for Western science to even accept the idea that something outside of the brain could be taking decisions. That there is now, we talk about the microbiome, we talked about gut bacteria, and even those who say get rid of corona are missing the point. It's part of the microbiome, like it or not. It's going to be in everybody's gut sooner or later. And there are a billion microbes like that.
Oh, back to China and India. I've always thought that if Chinese and Indians, who make up of over half the world together, could come
Almost.
together, rest together for a change, could come together. I don't believe in a world with boundaries. National boundaries are constructed and separate us. You know, we are all beings on a planet. There should be no boundaries. We should take care of each other, right? So we create in-group, out-groups through national boundaries. But I always thought that if China and India could come together and coexist.
Well, it's in a very ironic way. There are people of, what do you call, I don't know if it's even race is the right term, but there are people who have Chinese-looking features in 7 states in India. Actually, 7 out of 30 provinces in India, 7 out of 29 provinces in India have the the features from the Mongoloid or people with the different looking eyes and so on. And whenever there's any conflict between the two countries, there's the segregation and name calling that begins, which is very sad. But so the boundaries have always been fuzzy. There is no cut and dried, oh, you're from India or South Asia, and you're from China and many other countries. Bhutan, for example, is right in between, and so is Sikkim. Sikkim was incorporated into India, and many years ago. A lot of the people there look different. Nepal is another buffer region. There are many, the Arunachal Pradesh and many others. What is sad is that we go by morphological characteristics in looking at each other as different and similar. And when we just look at the morphology, the way our noses and the eyes and the chin and all that, then we are missing the whole point of being human. And yeah.
A conversation with you makes me think that this Northeast Asian Peacebuilding group, I wonder if they would be open to expanding it to Asia and having people come from India and Vietnam and Malaysia, because they focus on Northeast Asia.
Please tell me more about it. Tell us more about it. What is this Northeast Asia Peace Group?
Well, they were supported by Mennonites. Mennonites provided funding for a group of Asians to build a summer institute to promote peacebuilding. And Northeast Asia, because that's where most of them come from, but it's also the site of numerous historical wars between Japan, Korea, and China, and Mongolia and Taiwan and all that. So they wanted to focus on that because that's who they could access. But it's kind of like a United Nations of Asia, and the United Nations of Asia's representatives coming together to learn. It's an educational institute where there are workshops, highly interactive kinds of learning, culture sharing. But it just provides a model. The United Nations has deteriorated into a highly politicized body, where there's power struggles in the United Nations. And they have to fight to hold on, but we need to find ways to bring people together across nations at a grassroots level rather than a highly political level. I don't know, Jews have been doing Seeds of Peace with young people gathering, Jews and Palestinians.
Yeah, yes.
There are these grassroots efforts, but I think these grassroots efforts plant seeds and give hope and give a vision and an experience, so that people can learn to see no stranger, learn strategies for building peace through pluralism and unity and not through assimilation, right? these things I've participated in these kinds of things for college students over time, but they need to expand outside the college community. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm so glad, Tommy, that we're talking after so long. It's been like 7, 8 years, and I kept thinking about our interactions when I think I would send messages and you would send messages, but those are like, it's like likes on Facebook, not much more than that. But I'm so glad we are finally talking again. And I'm also glad we are sharing it. And so
Yeah.
many people brought us together, whether it was His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Dr. Jim Doty, Thupten Jinpa, to create the Center for Compassion. And yeah, I mean, I'm so grateful that we got together through synchronicity, if you will. And
Yeah.
there are no coincidences that we are talking again after so long. And I'm grateful that you made the time with your current health condition to actually have this long conversation.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. And I don't think it's an accident. I think it was meant
Uh,
to be.
Also, that reminds me, I would love to make sure that we share the work you're doing, whether it's on bias, the meditations on reducing bias, or the organization that's trying to bring education and peace in the Northeast Asia, or any other links. Please, we'll make sure that we share it with everybody. And even I
Yeah.
need to learn about the Northeast Asian Peace Initiative. There's so much to learn from each other. And if somebody wants to get in touch with you, is there a way they can do that other
So
than email? Because email is too dangerous to send out. Sorry?
my, my email's fine.
Okay. So we'll make sure that there are ways in which you can get in touch with Tommy as well as me if you have any questions. And I'm truly grateful that we're having this conversation. And there's so much to learn from each other. And yeah, the pandemic is literally asking us to rethink our relationship with each other, with us versus them, whether it's in the form of groups or in the form of individuals or even interspecies. Is Corona really our enemy, or is there a way in which we can befriend it and understand that sooner or later, whether we like it or not, is going to be a part of our microbiome? Isn't that funny? We have the tuberculosis virus in our body too. The tuberculosis, what we call Bacillus tuberculosis, in some form or the other. And there are so many other species that are residents. For every one DNA of Shankar, there are 10 DNAs of microbes in my own body. So, and that's true about everybody who is listening. So the idea that we have to somehow fight it out, it's so contradictory to even modern science, isn't it?
Well, that's because our strength is also our weakness in that we have bodies and minds and systems that are very complicated, but they could be very fragile and they could be very dysregulated. Um, and so then that's why we have these faulty alarms. So until we get to a place where our alarm systems are healthier and more accurate, we're vulnerable to this kind of behavior towards people and seeing them as strangers.
In fact, it was interesting. I knew at least one Nobel laureate Gary Mullis, who mentioned that most diseases are autoimmune. In other words, our own body is fighting against itself because it's like the dog's barking again. The dog's barking, oh, there's a stranger here, do something, do something. And then with immunity, when we are actually creating immunity using vaccines and all that, we're training our system to accept the fact that there will be others coming in, and
Right.
you don't have to go completely rebellious, but you're strong. It's like increasing self-esteem or self-compassion, saying, you'll survive with all these strangers coming into your body.
Well, we should be thankful that we have Zoom technology and media technology that allows us to connect across time and cultures. Maybe, you know, technology will help us to arrest our alarms and help us to reach another level of common humanity.
True, true. In fact, I mean, some of the most common songs in India today are Despacito, Señorita, as well as Open Gangnam Style from Korea. And yeah, there is pluralism in music now and in dance. So things are definitely changing. Kung Fu Panda and Bruce Lee are stars in India as well, and so are American stars, of course, and European stars, and even African stars. And music from many countries is now slowly becoming a global phenomenon. I see that as a form of inclusion, which is increasing with the millennials. And we were more segregated in our times.
Right. Well, you
So
know,
I'm very hopeful. Sorry?
I better go. I need to go and take care of my medicine. And
Oh, thanks again. And to anybody who is watching us, please stay in touch. Please stay in touch and please continue to share.
All right. And hello to everybody who watches this. And it was very special.
Thank you.
Bye.